What if I told you that, on a sweltering Friday afternoon in February 1967, a 24-year-old Australian officer ordered his platoon to fix bayonets and charge directly into hidden machine gun positions that had already slaughtered dozens of men? The men couldn't hear the order over the deafening roar of gunfire. Most of them no longer even carried bayonets. But they rose anyway, screaming, and ran forward into a wall of lead that cut down 8 out of 9 men in a single section within seconds. This wasn't heroic movie nonsense. This was Operation Bribie, and before we're done, you'll understand why this disaster happened, who was responsible, and why the truth was buried for 40 years. But to understand how Australian soldiers ended up in this meat grinder, we have to rewind 12 hours to a moment when everything still seemed manageable. At 2:30 in the morning on February 17, 1967, Major Gordon Murphy was shaken awake in his quarters at Nui Dat, the sprawling Australian base in Phuoc Tuy Province. The news was terse and urgent. A South Vietnamese regional force post at Lang Phuoc Hai, a coastal fishing village 15 kilometers to the southeast, was under attack from at least one company of Viet Cong. Murphy commanded a squadron of the 3rd Cavalry Regiment, and his M113 armored personnel carriers would be needed if the Australian task force decided to launch a reaction force. The intelligence was precise and confident. One company, maybe 100 men. A raid on a village, the kind of hit-and-run operation the VC had been executing for months. By 5 o'clock that morning, the estimate had been revised upward to 2 companies, and the Americans were reporting that the enemy had occupied Lang Phuoc Hai before withdrawing after heavy fighting with the South Vietnamese forces. 2 hours after that withdrawal, a new report arrived at the command post. A Viet Cong company had been spotted forming a tight perimeter in the rainforest 2 kilometers north of Lang Phuoc Hai, near the abandoned hamlet of Ap Mai An. The word tight should have triggered alarm bells. It suggested a defensive posture, not the scattered retreat of a raiding party. But no one at headquarters paid attention to that detail, because the pattern was familiar and reassuring. The VC always withdrew to their jungle bases after coastal raids. They hit hard, they disappeared fast, and they never stuck around to fight a pitched battle against superior firepower. Except this time, the pattern was about to break in the most catastrophic way imaginable. The intelligence was catastrophically wrong, but the men reading the reports in the air-conditioned command post had no way of knowing that yet. What they did know was that they were under enormous pressure to prove something. 6 months earlier, Australian forces had won a stunning defensive victory at the Battle of Long Tan, where a single company had held off a Viet Cong regiment and emerged victorious through discipline, firepower, and sheer guts. It had been the kind of triumph that validated the Australian approach to counterinsurgency warfare, a philosophy built on patience, deliberate operations, and intimate knowledge of the terrain. But in the corridors of power in Saigon, an American general named William Westmoreland was growing impatient with Australian caution. Westmoreland believed in attrition warfare, in search and destroy missions, in aggressive operations that measured success by body counts and tonnage of ordnance expended. The American war machine in Vietnam consumed resources at a staggering rate, burning through millions of dollars every single day to maintain the logistical infrastructure that kept 500,000 men supplied with ammunition, fuel, and food. In early 1967, Westmoreland had complained directly to Major General Tim Vincent, the commander of Australian Forces Vietnam, demanding a more aggressive approach from the Australians. The message was clear: stop being so careful. Start killing more enemy. Prove you can fight the American way. This pressure landed squarely on the shoulders of Brigadier Stuart Graham, who had taken command of the 1st Australian Task Force on January 7, 1967. Graham had been in the job for exactly 6 weeks. He was eager to prove that the Australians could conduct aggressive search and destroy operations without abandoning the principles that had made them effective. But there was a problem. The task force consisted of only 2 infantry battalions plus supporting units, a force far too small to destroy the Viet Cong formations operating in Phuoc Tuy province through sheer mass, where the Americans could deploy entire brigades and divisions to sweep through contested territory. The Australians had to make do with what amounted to a reinforced brigade operating in a province roughly the size of an average Australian county. The 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, had been tasked with hunting the elusive D445 Battalion, a provincial Viet Cong unit that had been a thorn in Australian operations since their arrival. Just days earlier, the battalion had suffered casualties from friendly fire when a New Zealand artillery battery had mistakenly shelled their positions, killing 4 men and wounding 13, including a warrant officer who had earned the Distinguished Conduct Medal at Long Tan. The incident had rattled morale and raised questions about coordination between Allied units. Graham needed a win, and he needed it fast. When the report came in about the Viet Cong company at Ap My An, it looked like the perfect opportunity. At 10:20 in the morning, Lieutenant Colonel Colin Townsend, the commanding officer of 6th RAR, was called to the task force command post for a briefing. The orders were simple: launch a quick reaction force, insert blocking positions to cut off the enemy's withdrawal routes, sweep westward and destroy them, be back before dark. Townsend walked out of that briefing with verbal orders only because there was no time to prepare written operation orders. At 11:30, he issued those verbal orders to his company commanders. The clock was already ticking, and it would not stop until the sun went down. They had less than 6 hours to plan, execute, and conclude a battalion-level operation against an enemy of unknown strength in unfamiliar terrain. While Townsend was racing to brief his officers, the enemy was doing something the Australians had never seen D445 do before. They were digging in and preparing to stand and fight. The 445 Battalion, also known as the D445 Provincial Mobile Battalion, or the Bahria Battalion, was not some ragtag guerrilla force cobbled together from reluctant conscripts and political zealots. By 1967, it had evolved into one of the most formidable units the 1st Australian Task Force would ever face. Formed in May 1965, the battalion had cut its teeth against the American 173rd Airborne Brigade and had fought at Long Tan 6 months earlier, where it had supported the main assault by attempting to outflank the Australians from the south. It consisted of 3 rifle companies and 1 weapons company, approximately 350 men recruited primarily from the villages of Dat Do, Long Dien, and Hoa Long. These were local fighters with intimate knowledge of every trail, every creek bed, and every patch of jungle in Phuoc Tuy province. They knew which paths flooded during the monsoon season and which remained passable year-round. They knew where the best ambush sites were located and how long it took Australian forces to react to contact. They had survived multiple large-scale operations by American and South Vietnamese forces, learning from each encounter how to better camouflage their positions, how to evacuate their casualties more efficiently, and how to inflict maximum damage before melting back into the jungle. They had learned to evacuate their casualties, to camouflage their positions, to hold their fire until the enemy was fully committed. In 1971, an Australian intelligence assessment would describe D445 as possessing battlefield skill and determination equivalent to main force Viet Cong or North Vietnamese Army units. No one took them lightly, or at least no one should have. The position the Viet Cong had chosen at Ap My An was not hastily improvised. It was an old defensive site that had been fortified previously, and now it was being reoccupied and improved with the kind of professional attention to detail that only comes from hard-won battlefield experience. The fighting pits were covered and expertly camouflaged with vegetation that blended seamlessly into the surrounding jungle. Fresh branches and leaves had been woven into overhead cover that would be nearly impossible to detect from more than a few meters away. The fields of fire had been carefully planned to create interlocking zones of death, with each machine gun position able to support its neighbors and cover any dead ground that might provide attacking forces with cover. At least 6 heavy machine guns were positioned to deliver enfilade fire from multiple angles, their crews having rehearsed their sectors of fire and established contingency positions in case their primary fighting holes were discovered or destroyed. 75mm recoilless rifles were sighted to engage any armored vehicles that might approach, their crews prepared to fire and immediately displace before return fire could find them. Snipers had climbed into the trees to spot targets and create chaos among attacking forces, their elevated positions giving them clear fields of fire over the heads of their comrades in the fighting pits below. The position formed a U-shaped killing zone designed to draw the enemy in and then destroy them from 3 sides simultaneously, a classic ambush configuration that had been refined through centuries of guerrilla warfare. This was not a campsite where exhausted raiders were catching their breath before fleeing to safety. This was a fortress, and the men defending it had been given a mission that required them to hold their ground no matter the cost. Intelligence suggested they were covering the withdrawal of a larger force, possibly even a divisional headquarters moving through the area to avoid Australian patrols. Their orders were explicit. Let the Australians commit, hold fire until they cannot retreat, then kill as many as possible before withdrawing under the cover of darkness. The discipline required to execute such a plan was extraordinary, demanding that soldiers watch their enemies approach without firing a shot, allowing them to close to point-blank range before unleashing hell. It would be tested to the absolute limit in the hours to come. At 12:35 in the afternoon, the 1st Australian forces moved toward the trap. C Company, under the command of Major Brian McFarlane, was inserted by M113 armored personnel carriers with the mission of securing a helicopter landing zone designated LZ Amber, located 3 kilometers east of Hoi Mai and just north of the hamlet of Ap My An. The APCs ground forward through the heat, their tracks churning up red dust that hung in the still air like a visible marker of their approach. And as they approached the jungle fringe, the soldiers inside began to notice an increasing volume of overs, the distinctive crack of bullets passing overhead that every infantryman learns to recognize. It was an ominous sign, suggesting that enemy forces were already in the area and tracking the Australian advance, but the company pressed on toward their objective. Then, inexplicably, they halted short of the landing zone. The reason for this halt has never been satisfactorily explained in the official records or the post-battle accounts. One theory suggests they were waiting for artillery batteries to be moved forward to ensure fire support would be available, but this seems unlikely given that the landing zone was only minutes away and artillery could have been shifted forward while the company was in motion. Another theory holds that they spotted enemy movement and were consolidating their position before pushing forward, but no contact was reported at this stage. Whatever the cause, C Company sat and waited while the volume of fire passing over their positions continued to increase, the invisible fingers of death plucking at the air above their heads with increasing frequency. At 13:45, the first wave of American UH-1 Iroquois helicopters clattered over the tree line and descended toward LZ Amber, carrying A Company into what would become a nightmare. A company shook out into an open formation with a frontage of 150 meters, the textbook deployment for moving through jungle terrain where visibility was measured in tens of meters rather than hundreds. 2nd Platoon, commanded by 2nd Lieutenant Graham Ackland, took the right flank. 3rd Platoon moved on the left. 1st Platoon followed in depth, ready to reinforce whichever forward element made contact first. The plan was to advance south into the jungle and make contact with what intelligence still described as a Viet Cong company in a temporary defensive position, probably catching its breath after the raid on Lang Puak Hai. The men moved forward with their weapons at the ready, sweat already soaking through their uniforms in the oppressive heat that turned the jungle into a humid oven, where every breath felt like inhaling wet wool. They had covered 150 meters, moving cautiously through the undergrowth and scanning the dense vegetation for any sign of the enemy, when 2nd Platoon spotted a sniper in a tree. The platoon sergeant shot him, and the body tumbled from the branches in a tangle of limbs and equipment, crashing through the foliage to land with a heavy thump on the jungle floor. Almost simultaneously, 3rd Platoon came under small arms fire from multiple positions, and the company headquarters group was engaged by additional snipers hidden in the canopy, whose muzzle flashes were the only indication of their presence. The jungle erupted with the sound of automatic weapons, the controlled bursts of the Viet Cong machine guns mixing with the sharper crack of AK-47 rifles and the deeper hammering of the Australian L-1A1 SLRs returning fire. Ackland made the decision that aggressive infantry are trained to make when ambushed. He ordered his platoon to assault straight into the enemy position with grenades and machine guns, rushing forward to close with the enemy before they could fully exploit their superior knowledge of the terrain. They broke into the Viet Cong fighting pits, killing several defenders at close range in brutal hand-to-hand, fighting that saw grenades thrown into bunkers and automatic weapons fired at ranges measured in meters. But the cost was immediate and shocking. 6 men went down in less than 1 minute, a third of the lead platoon wounded in the initial volleys that tore through their ranks with industrial efficiency. Ackland suddenly realized he was not facing a company-sized camp of disorganized raiders catching their breath. He was facing a sizable and well-dug-in force with at least 5 or 6 machine guns firing from prepared positions, their interlocking fields of fire creating a web of death that made movement suicidal. His platoon was pinned down and in serious trouble. For the next 20 minutes, a company fought desperately to extricate itself from a position that was rapidly becoming untenable. Movement drew fire from multiple directions, with every attempt to advance or withdraw met by withering bursts from hidden machine guns whose positions could not be accurately identified through the smoke and dense vegetation. The jungle visibility was measured in meters, and the enemy was almost completely invisible behind their camouflage and overhead cover that made them blend seamlessly into the surrounding terrain. By 14:10, a company had pulled back to the jungle fringe, having suffered 7 men wounded and expended most of their ammunition in the brutal exchange. Major O'Brien, the company commander, radioed Lieutenant Colonel Townsend and reported that they had made contact with a Viet Cong position of at least company size. He still called it a camp, which suggests that even after 20 minutes of brutal combat that had cost him a third of one platoon, the Australians had not yet grasped the true nature of what they were facing. The assumption that this was a temporary position occupied by withdrawing raiders persisted despite all evidence to the contrary. Townsend arrived by helicopter as a company's casualties were being evacuated by Australian Iroquois helicopters from No. 9 Squadron RAAF, their door gunners scanning the tree line for any sign of enemy activity as the wounded were loaded aboard. The APCs carrying C Company and the battalion's mortar platoon rumbled into position, and D Company was inserted by helicopter and immediately moved to establish blocking positions in the tree line northeast of the landing zone, their mission to prevent the enemy from escaping to the east once the main assault began. 3 companies were now committed to the battle, and the planning for the main assault began in earnest. The decision was made. B Company would assault from the south. A company would provide fire support from the left flank. D Company would block to the east. C Company and the APCs would be positioned to the northwest. It should have been overwhelming force against a trapped enemy, a textbook example of combined arms warfare where infantry, armor, and artillery would work together to crush a cornered opponent. But the plan was built on a foundation of false assumptions, and every single one of those assumptions was about to be shattered in the most violent way possible. B Company was not an ordinary infantry unit. Its commander, Major Ian McKay, was a former member of what would become the Special Air Service Regiment, a veteran of the Malayan Emergency, where he had learned jungle warfare from British instructors who had spent years fighting communist insurgents in the dense rainforests of Southeast Asia, and an officer who had served as an instructor at the British Army Jungle Warfare School, where he had taught a generation of officers the skills they would need to survive in the most unforgiving combat environment on Earth. He had trained his company to Special Forces fitness standards and demanded a level of discipline and teamwork that he believed would inspire the kind of mateship and confidence necessary to perform under extreme pressure when bullets were flying and men were dying. His men trusted him, respected his combat experience, and knew he would never ask them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. They were about to follow him into the closest thing to hell that any of them would ever experience. At 15:35, B Company crossed the start line with 2 platoons forward, 4 platoon and 6 platoon, moving in a classic assault formation designed to maximize firepower while minimizing vulnerability to ambush. They had advanced only meters from their starting positions when they came under sustained sniper and machine gun fire from multiple directions, the carefully planned ambush springing shut around them with devastating effect. Every step forward took them deeper into a U-shaped position where fire from the flanks intensified with each meter of ground covered, creating a gauntlet of death that channeled the Australians into the killing zone. Men were hit everywhere, stumbling and falling in the dense vegetation as bullets found them, their cries of pain and shock mixing with the continuous roar of gunfire. Visibility was limited to only a few meters, and hardly an enemy soldier could be seen despite the murderous volume of fire pouring into the Australian ranks from positions that remained invisible in the smoke and undergrowth. 4 platoon became pinned down by heavy machine gun fire from the left, unable to advance or retreat without suffering additional casualties, and 6 platoon moved through their positions to continue the assault, taking the lead in the desperate push forward. The order came down to 6 platoon, destroy the machine gun position, fix bayonets. The men of 6 platoon rose from cover, yelling, and charged forward into a storm of automatic weapons fire that met them like a physical wall. Enemy bullets tore through some of them immediately, the heavy 7.62 millimeter rounds from the machine guns spinning men around and dropping them in their tracks, and the rest were driven to the ground by the sheer volume of fire that made standing upright equivalent to suicide. The assault failed with heavy losses, and the survivors were left clinging to whatever cover they could find, pinned down and unable to move forward or back without exposing themselves to the interlocking fields of fire. Then the order was given to 5 platoon, commanded by 2nd Lieutenant John Patrick O'Halloran, a young officer facing his first major combat action. Advance 30 meters and try to outflank the same gun. O'Halloran shouted the order to fix bayonets, but most of his men no longer carried the weapon, having discarded them as unnecessary weight during months of patrolling where the bayonet was seen as an anachronism from a previous era of warfare. Others could not hear him over the deafening din of gunfire, the crack of incoming rounds, the explosions of grenades, and the screams of the wounded that created a symphony of violence that drowned out all attempts at communication. But they understood the intent, and on his order, the platoon as one arose and ran forward, yelling and screaming in a desperate attempt to break through the enemy position with shock and violence, the primal human instinct to close with and destroy the enemy, overriding the rational knowledge that they were running into certain death. They were cut down almost immediately. Hidden machine guns that had not revealed themselves during the first assault opened fire from the right flank with devastating effect, their crews having held their fire to lure the Australians deeper into the trap. 8 members of the 9-man strong first section were either killed or wounded in a matter of seconds, the concentrated fire cutting through their ranks like a scythe through wheat. Lance Corporal Kerry Rooney from Red Hill, Queensland, led his section directly at the machine gun position and fell to one knee to throw grenades while bullets snapped through the air around him, his courage in the face of overwhelming fire inspiring those who survived to keep fighting even as their comrades fell. Corporal Robin William Jones attacked the Viet Cong at close range with grenades and small arms fire, inflicting heavy casualties on the defenders and proving that Australian soldiers could match the enemy's ferocity when the situation demanded it. But 3 previously undetected machine guns engaged 5 platoon with intense enfilade fire that killed 3 more men and wounded 5 others in rapid succession. Of Jonas' entire section, he alone was left unwounded, and for his leadership under fire, he would later be awarded the military medal, though the recognition would come years later when the wounds had scarred over but never fully healed. The Australian assault had stalled after advancing only 25 meters, less than the length of a suburban backyard, having paid for that tiny patch of jungle real estate with the blood of nearly half the men in the forward elements. Nearly half of the men in the forward 2 sections had become casualties, and 5 platoon was almost surrounded, taking heavy fire from multiple directions that made any movement an invitation to death. The wounded desperately needed to be evacuated, and the survivors needed to be withdrawn from positions where they lay just meters from enemy guns, whose crews could hear them breathing and calling for medics. Private Richard Beverly Odendahl, the platoon stretcher bearer whose job was to save lives rather than take them, repeatedly risked his life by crawling through the fire to drag wounded men to safety, providing first aid under impossible conditions, where every second spent treating a casualty meant exposure to enemy fire, recovering weapons from the dead so they wouldn't fall into enemy hands, and providing O'Halloran with critical information about the disposition of his shattered platoon. For his actions that day, Odendahl would receive the military medal, though like Jones he would have traded the decoration for the return of his dead comrades in a heartbeat. But medals were a distant concern in the immediate reality of the battle. The conditions were appalling. The heat was stinking and oppressive, turning the jungle into a furnace where men gasped for breath between bouts of firing, and the wounded suffered from shock exacerbated by dehydration. Incendiary grenades had started fires that filled the jungle with smoke, blinding many of the soldiers and making it nearly impossible to see more than a few meters in any direction. The acrid chemical smell mixing with the copper tang of blood and the distinctive odor of cordite. Movement of any kind meant you were shot or shot at, with every rustle of vegetation drawing fire from multiple positions. The Australians called in artillery and mortar fire danger close to their own positions, the shells screaming overhead to impact just meters from the forward elements, and the explosions walked back and forth across the enemy defenses, while B Company hugged the ground and prayed the rounds would fall on target rather than among their own positions. At approximately 6 o'clock in the evening, after hours of sustained combat that had reduced B Company to a desperate band of survivors clinging to whatever cover they could find, the armored personnel carriers that had been securing the landing zone were dispatched as a relief force to extract the pinned infantry. But the APC crews had trouble locating B Company's exact positions due to the smoke, the confusion, and the chaos of the firefight that had transformed the jungle into a vision of hell on earth. As the M113S ground forward through the jungle, their aluminum hulls offering protection against small arms fire, but vulnerable to heavier weapons, Viet Cong soldiers armed with anti-tank weapons engaged them with 75mm recoilless rifles whose high explosive shells could punch through the thin armor like tissue paper. At 18:10, one of the APCs was hit at close range by a high explosive round that struck the open cargo hatch where wounded soldiers were being evacuated. The driver, Vic Pomeroy, was killed instantly, his body torn apart by the blast that filled the crew compartment with shrapnel and burning fragments. The crew commander was wounded. Infantry casualties who were already wounded and being evacuated inside the vehicle were re-wounded by shrapnel and the concussive blast that turned the interior of the APC into a charnel house. The screams of the wounded mixing with the roar of the burning vehicle. The APC was disabled and could not be moved under fire, its tracks blown off and its engine compartment burning. By 1815, the remaining APCs had fought their way to B Company's position and began loading the most seriously wounded soldiers, while their machine guns suppressed the Viet Cong positions with withering fire that forced the enemy to keep their heads down. Between 1820 and 1845, the Viet Cong launched 2 successive counterattacks in an attempt to overrun the Australian positions and finish what they had started. Waves of soldiers emerging from the jungle to assault the consolidated positions, but both were repulsed by the combined fire of the infantry and the armored vehicles, whose machine guns created zones of death that nothing could survive. At 1900 hours, after 5 continuous hours of combat that had seemed like an eternity to the men doing the fighting, B Company finally broke contact and withdrew under the cover of mortars, artillery fire, and airstrikes that pounded the enemy positions and allowed the Australians to extract themselves from the killing zone. The battalion consolidated into a night harbor position near the landing zone, and the disabled APC was set on fire by the Australians because it could not be recovered under enemy fire, and they would not leave it as a trophy for the enemy. The battle was officially over at 1930. And the men who survived it sat dazed, stressed, wet, and tired in the backs of armored personnel carriers throughout the night, nervously and anxiously pondering what was happening to their missing mates who remained on the battlefield in the darkness. While the Australians huddled in their defensive positions, weapons loaded and pointed outward in case the enemy decided to probe their perimeter. The battlefield was pounded by artillery fire that continued into the evening, the shells screaming overhead to impact on the positions the Viet Cong had held just hours before. An AC-47 Spooky gunship circled overhead, its miniguns capable of firing 6,000 rounds per minute, creating a solid stream of tracer fire that looked like a laser beam reaching down from the sky, and napalm strikes incinerated the enemy positions, the jellied gasoline creating fireballs that turned night into day, and made a terrible job even worse for the soldiers who would be detailed to return to the scene the following morning to search for bodies and equipment. Under the cover of darkness and the bombardment that made movement above ground suicidal, the men of D445 Battalion executed a disciplined withdrawal, evacuating most of their dead and wounded, and leaving behind a position that had served its purpose of bleeding the Australians white. On the morning of February 18th, 6th RAR returned to the battlefield in assault formation with C Company on the left, D Company on the right, and A Company in reserve, ready to reinforce wherever contact was made. B Company was left out of the battle because their casualties had been too severe, and the survivors were in no condition to fight another engagement without rest and reorganization. The Australians advanced through the enemy position and found that the Viet Cong had vanished during the night like ghosts, leaving behind only evidence of the carnage that had occurred. A sweep of the area revealed a few enemy dead and many abandoned packs and equipment, but the majority of the bodies had been removed in accordance with the Viet Cong practice of denying their enemies the satisfaction of counting corpses and claiming victories based on body counts. 7th Platoon from C Company, moving on the right flank through the dense jungle where every step could trigger an ambush, found B Company's dead from the previous day, and miraculously, they also found one wounded soldier who was still alive after spending the night alone on the battlefield, a testament to human endurance that defied belief. The Australians counted several Viet Cong bodies, but the exact number killed would remain a subject of debate and propaganda for decades as both sides manipulated the figures to support their narratives. Then the soldiers came upon the destroyed armored personnel carrier, still smoldering from the fire that had consumed it the night before, its aluminum hull twisted and blackened by the flames. On the side of the blackened hull, someone had written a message in blood, using the life fluid of the Australian soldiers as ink to deliver a final insult. Du me uk dai loi, the Vietnamese equivalent of get fucked Australians. Back at Nui Dat, the casualty reports were being tallied, and the numbers told a story that official assessments would spend decades trying to obscure behind claims of victory and enemy casualties that could not be verified. The fighting had cost 6th RAR 7 men killed and 27 wounded. A squadron of the 3rd Cavalry Regiment had lost 1 man killed, their driver, Vic Pomeroy, and 1 wounded. The total Australian casualties stood at 8 dead and 28 wounded, along with 1 armored personnel carrier destroyed. In terms of the operational strength lost, it was equivalent to an entire platoon wiped out in a single afternoon, 36 men rendered combat ineffective through death or wounds serious enough to require evacuation. The Viet Cong casualty figures were far more difficult to establish with any certainty. Only 8 bodies had been recovered from the battlefield, but Australian intelligence assessments based on fresh graves found along the withdrawal route and blood trails leading into the jungle estimated enemy losses at between 50 and 70 killed, figures that seemed suspiciously convenient given the Australian need to demonstrate that the operation had been a success. Hanoi declared that the Viet Cong had won a decisive victory and claimed to have inflicted heavy losses on the Australians while suffering minimal casualties themselves, propaganda that played well in North Vietnam but bore little relationship to reality. Brigadier Graham, the task force commander who had ordered the operation in the first place, also claimed a major triumph and later stated that the Viet Cong had got a thrashing, a characterization that would have come as news to the men who had actually fought the battle. But the soldiers who had actually fought the battle and bled in the jungle had a very different assessment that reflected the reality they had experienced. Private Robin Harris of 5 Platoon later wrote that he believed the enemy losses had been overstated and that it was us who copped a hiding, an honest evaluation that contradicted the official narrative but rang true to anyone who had been there. A PC commander, David Clifton, recalled that we had been soundly thrashed on Operation Bribie, a blunt assessment that cut through the propaganda and political spin to describe what had actually happened. Major General Tim Vincent, the commander of Australian Forces Vietnam, who had been on the receiving end of Westmoreland's demands for more aggressive operations, believed that any success had been marginal at best, and privately questioned whether the operation had been worth the cost in lives. Perhaps the most honest assessment came from Ian MacKay himself, who would later write that the truth of Operation Bribie was that the Australians and Viet Cong had thoroughly belted each other, a characterization that acknowledged the courage and skill of both sides while avoiding the triumphalism that characterized official accounts. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. For the first time in 9 months of operations, the 1st Australian Task Force had suffered a casualty exchange ratio that worked against them, with confirmed Australian casualties exceeding confirmed enemy casualties for the first time since their arrival in country. In terms of confirmed body count versus their own losses, it was the worst result they had experienced in Vietnam to that point, a fact that no amount of spin could disguise. When combined with casualties from Operation Renmark, which had begun just days after Bribie and resulted in 7 men from 5th RAR killed in a single mine incident that wiped out most of a patrol in seconds, February 1967 became the bloodiest month for the task force since its arrival in country. 16 men killed and 55 wounded in a single week. The losses were beginning to mount, and the task force appeared to have lost the initiative it had seized at Long Tan, where disciplined firepower and superior tactics had defeated a much larger enemy force. The impact on D445 Battalion was also significant, though perhaps not as devastating as Australian intelligence claimed. Intelligence reports indicated that the unit was unable to mount a full battalion operation for the remainder of 1967, their losses forcing them to operate in smaller, company-sized groups rather than as a cohesive battalion, and their losses were increasingly filled by North Vietnamese regulars rather than local recruits, as the war of attrition ground down the indigenous Viet Cong forces. But the battalion survived as a cohesive fighting force, and would continue to be described by Australian intelligence as one of the most formidable opponents they faced until the final withdrawal in 1971, a testament to their resilience and tactical skill. The casualty figures, terrible as they were not the real scandal. The real scandal was that every single death and every single wound had been preventable, the inevitable result of institutional failures rather than tactical misfortune or the fog of war. The disaster at Ap My An was not the result of bad luck or the fog of war that occasionally produces defeats despite the best planning and execution. It was the inevitable consequence of a cascade of institutional failures that began at the highest levels of command and flowed downward until it drowned young men in a jungle killing zone from which there was no escape. The intelligence failure was comprehensive and multi-layered, starting with the initial estimate and compounding with each subsequent report that reinforced existing assumptions rather than challenging them. The initial estimate of one company was wrong by a factor of 2 or 3, a fundamental misreading of enemy strength that shaped every subsequent decision. The assumption that the enemy was withdrawing was the opposite of reality, mistaking a deliberate defensive preparation for a hasty retreat. The description of the position as a camp rather than a fortified defensive site was a catastrophic misreading of the enemy's intentions that led commanders to underestimate the threat and overestimate the ease with which the position could be taken. But the intelligence failure was only the beginning. The time pressure imposed by Brigadier Graham's order to return before dark created conditions where proper planning and reconnaissance became impossible, forcing commanders to make decisions based on incomplete information and gut instinct rather than careful analysis. Lieutenant Colonel Townsend had issued verbal orders only because there was no time to prepare written operation orders that would have forced a more thorough consideration of the challenges and risks. Company commanders had minutes to brief their platoon leaders rather than the hours normally allocated for mission planning. There was no opportunity for detailed reconnaissance of the objective, no chance to study the terrain, and no contingency planning for what would happen if the enemy chose to stand and fight instead of melting away into the jungle, as intelligence predicted they would. The tactical execution compounded these errors through piecemeal commitment of forces that violated one of the fundamental principles of warfare. Companies were inserted sequentially rather than as a coordinated assault, which meant a company walked into the enemy position essentially alone and paid the price in blood before the other companies could provide support. Even after a company's shock encounter and withdrawal that should have made clear the strength and preparation of the enemy position, the Australian command continued to believe they were facing a camp rather than a prepared defensive position occupied by a determined enemy. B Company was ordered to conduct a frontal assault against an enemy whose strength and defensive preparations had already been demonstrated by the casualties inflicted on A Company, repeating the same mistake and expecting different results. The use of bayonet charges against fortified machine gun positions was a tactic that would not have been out of place on the Western Front in 1917. But it had no business being employed in the jungles of Vietnam in 1967, where the lessons of modern warfare should have been applied. The orders were given, and the men obeyed them with a courage that deserved a better fate than to be cut down in a futile charge that achieved nothing except to add to the casualty count. The root cause of the disaster lay in the toxic pressure being applied from the very top of the chain of command, pressure that valued appearance over substance and aggression over effectiveness. General Westmoreland in Saigon was demanding aggressive operations from the Australians, measuring success by the number of operations conducted rather than their tactical or strategic value. Major General Vincent was passing that pressure down to Brigadier Graham, who in turn needed to demonstrate that his command could deliver results. Graham, who had been in command for only 6 weeks and was still learning the nuances of the situation in Phuoc Tuy province, was trying to prove that Australian forces could conduct American-style search and destroy missions without abandoning their principles of careful planning and deliberate execution. And Lieutenant Colonel Townsend was caught in the middle, ordered to plan and execute a battalion-level operation in less than 6 hours with inadequate intelligence and insufficient time for proper preparation, forced to balance the demands from above with the safety of his men below. The system was designed to reward aggression and punish caution, and it produced exactly the outcome that such incentives guaranteed when institutional priorities trumped tactical wisdom. The after-action reports identified many of the problems that had contributed to the disaster. the need for better reconnaissance before committing forces to an assault on an enemy position of unknown strength. The dangers of piecemeal insertion that allowed the enemy to defeat Australian forces in detail. The importance of proper planning time that would allow commanders to develop contingency plans and coordinate supporting fires. The critical necessity of accurate intelligence about enemy strength and dispositions rather than assumptions based on past patterns of enemy behavior. Calls were made for reinforcements, specifically a 3rd Infantry Battalion and tank support to give the infantry the firepower they needed in close jungle fighting, where machine guns and recoilless rifles could decimate attacking forces before they could close with the enemy. But change came slowly, as it always does in military organizations, where institutional inertia and budget constraints limit the speed at which lessons can be implemented. The 3rd Battalion would not arrive for nearly a year, leaving the task force to continue operations with insufficient strength to conduct the aggressive operations that Westmoreland demanded. Tanks would eventually be deployed, but only after the conventional wisdom about the role of armor in counterinsurgency warfare had been challenged and overturned by bitter experience that demonstrated their value in providing close-fire support to infantry operating in dense terrain. The most important lesson, however, was never fully learned, as evidenced by subsequent operations that repeated many of the same mistakes. The 1st Australian Task Force continued to conduct quick reaction operations despite the risks that Bribie had demonstrated, responding to intelligence reports with hasty operations that left little time for proper planning. The pressure for aggressive action from American commanders did not diminish, and if anything increased as the war dragged on, and Westmoreland sought to demonstrate progress through body counts and operational tempo. And the fundamental mismatch between Australian counterinsurgency doctrine and the demands of American-style attrition warfare was never resolved, leaving the Australians caught between their own tactical wisdom and the strategic demands of their senior partner. The Australians were being asked to fight a big war with a small force, and Operation Bribie had demonstrated the cost of that impossible equation in the most brutal terms possible. For the men who fought at Ap Mai On, the battle became a wound that never fully healed, a trauma that they carried for the rest of their lives. In the immediate aftermath, the official narrative emphasized success, highlighting the enemy casualties and the fact that the Viet Cong had been driven from the field. The enemy had been engaged and driven from the field. Casualties had been inflicted. The mission to block their withdrawal had been partially successful. But the soldiers knew better, and they carried that knowledge in silence for decades. Many of them felt deep in their bones that Bribie had been a defeat, and they carried that knowledge in silence for decades, unable to reconcile their experience with the official narrative of success. The battle was overshadowed by Long Tan, which had occurred 6 months earlier, and which became the focus of public commemoration and national remembrance, the victory that defined the Australian experience in Vietnam. Vietnam Veterans Day in Australia honors the anniversary of Long Tan, not Bribie, reflecting the national preference for celebrating victories rather than examining defeats. The men who fought at both battles showed equal courage and faced equal danger, but only one battle received the recognition it deserved, while the other was quietly forgotten by all except those who had been there. Ian Mackay left the army and became a successful businessman and an international rugby player, achievements that should have brought him satisfaction and a sense of accomplishment. But he carried Bribie with him everywhere he went, the weight of that day never fully lifting from his shoulders. For 40 years, he did not speak publicly about the battle, the memories too painful and the questions too uncomfortable. It was too painful, too raw, and perhaps too controversial for a nation that wanted to remember its victories rather than examine its failures and ask hard questions about why those failures had occurred. But around 1997, 30 years after the battle, Mackay began giving talks about Operation Bribie, and his motivation was simple and powerful, driven by a need to honor the men who had fought and died. He wanted to give credit to the marvelous tenacity, courage, and camaraderie of the brilliant young soldiers who had fought so bravely on that hot Friday afternoon in Vietnam. Men who had obeyed orders they knew might kill them and had charged into machine gun fire because that was what their training and their mateship demanded. He wanted the world to know that the conditions had been appalling, that many men had been almost blinded by the smoke from fires, and that it had been a fight to the death against a determined and efficient enemy near the village of Hoi Mai in Phuoc Tuy province, not the one-sided victory that official accounts suggested. The story Mackay told was controversial because it challenged the official narrative of success and forced uncomfortable questions about command decisions and institutional priorities that had led to the disaster. Publishers hesitated, uncertain whether there was an audience for a story that contradicted the accepted narrative and raised questions about decisions made decades earlier. The Australian military establishment was not eager to revisit a battle that raised more questions than it answered, preferring to let sleeping dogs lie rather than reopening old wounds. But Mackay refused to change a single word of his account, insisting on telling the truth as he had experienced it, regardless of how uncomfortable that truth might be. And in 2017, on the 50th anniversary of the battle, his book, Phantoms of Bribie, was finally published. That same year, a major commemoration was held at the Vietnam Veterans Park on Bribie Island in Queensland, a location that carried its own bitter irony that was not lost on the veterans who attended. Bribie Island is a popular vacation destination, a place of beaches and relaxation where families spend their holidays in the sun and surf, and the battle had been named after it through the Australian tradition of using geographic locations from home as operation names. The men who gather there every February 17th to honor their fallen comrades do so in a place that represents peace and leisure, a stark contrast to the hell they experienced in the jungle half a century ago when they fought for their lives in conditions that no vacation brochure could ever describe. Mackay spoke at that commemoration, and his words captured the essence of what Bribie means to those who survived it and carried its weight for 50 years. It's a day when we share with all present the deep sorrow for all those who did not survive the horror of that desperate, long battle on 17th February 1967, which will forever remain in our memories. We remember with shared emotions, intensity, and camaraderie the fine, brave men of B Company and our supporting troops. The recognition came 5 decades too late for many, including those who died before the truth could be told, and those who lived but never received the acknowledgement they deserved. Operation Bribie changed the Australian approach to the war, though perhaps not as much as it should have given the clarity of the lessons it taught. The immediate impact reinforced the Australian preference for deliberate operations over hasty reactions, validating the approach that had been working before Westmoreland's pressure for aggression had led to Bribie. The tactical lessons about the dangers of piecemeal commitment and the importance of proper reconnaissance were incorporated into training and planning, ensuring that future operations would at least benefit from the blood that had been spilled to learn these lessons. Equipment changes followed, including the eventual deployment of Centurion tanks to provide the infantry with armored support in close terrain, a decision that challenged decades of doctrine about the role of tanks in counterinsurgency but which proved invaluable in subsequent operations. But American pressure for aggressive operations continued unabated, and the Australian task force found itself repeatedly caught between its own hard-won tactical wisdom and the strategic demands of its senior partner, who measured success differently. D445. Battalion remained a potent threat throughout the remainder of the war, a constant reminder that the enemy could not be destroyed through attrition alone, and that local knowledge, discipline, and tactical skill could offset enormous disparities in firepower and technology. The lessons of Bribie have been taught at military academies and staff colleges for decades as a case study in what happens when time pressure overrides tactical wisdom, when intelligence assumptions replace verification, and when institutional priorities take precedence over the lives of soldiers, providing future officers with a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting political and career considerations drive tactical decisions. The parallels to later conflicts are unavoidable and troubling. In Afghanistan and Iraq, coalition forces face similar challenges to those that confronted the Australians at Bribie. Enemies who chose when and where to fight, using their knowledge of the terrain and the population to offset technological and numerical superiority. Intelligence that was incomplete or wrong, shaped by assumptions and wishful thinking rather than hard evidence. Political pressure for visible action that created operational time constraints and forced commanders to launch operations before they were properly prepared. Body counts that measured activity but not progress, creating perverse incentives to prioritize operations that produced casualties rather than strategic effects. And always, the fundamental question of whether a small professional force can successfully conduct large-scale conventional operations in an environment designed for insurgency, a question that Bribie had answered in the negative, but which subsequent generations of military planners chose to ignore. The annual commemorations at Bribie Island continue, though the ranks of veterans grow thinner with each passing year, as age and illness take their toll on the survivors. The younger generations who attend learn about a battle that has largely been forgotten by the broader public, but which remains seared into the memories of those who were there and lived with its aftermath for decades. The men who gather speak of mates lost and wounds that never fully healed, physical scars that remind them of that day, and psychological scars that run far deeper. And they remind anyone who will listen that the soldiers who fought at Bribie deserve the same recognition as those who fought at Long Tan, that courage in defeat is no less worthy of honor than courage in victory. The question that hangs over every commemoration is whether the lessons have truly been learned, or whether they will need to be purchased again in blood in some future conflict when institutional amnesia and political pressure combine to repeat the mistakes of the past. Operation Bribie was not just a tactical engagement that went wrong due to bad luck or poor execution. It was a perfect demonstration of the systemic problems that would eventually lead to the failure of the entire war effort in Vietnam, a microcosm of everything that was wrong with the American approach to the war. The reliance on firepower over intelligence, the belief that superior technology could compensate for inferior understanding of the enemy and the environment, the emphasis on body counts over strategic progress, measuring success by the number of enemy killed rather than ground held or political objectives achieved. The disconnect between command perceptions and ground reality, with generals in air-conditioned headquarters making decisions based on maps and reports, while soldiers in the field dealt with the consequences. The pressure to demonstrate aggression rather than effectiveness, rewarding commanders who launched operations regardless of their utility or cost. The belief that overwhelming material superiority could compensate for an adequate understanding of the enemy and the environment, that enough bombs and bullets could solve problems that were fundamentally political and social. These were not problems unique to the Australians, who were actually more aware of these issues than their American allies. They were inherent in the entire Allied approach to the war, and Bribie simply revealed them in miniature, providing a case study in how not to conduct counterinsurgency operations. The warning that Operation Bribie offers to military planners and political leaders has not lost its relevance in the decades since the battle was fought. When career advancement depends on demonstrating aggression rather than achieving results, soldiers die in operations that serve no purpose beyond padding the resume of ambitious officers. When intelligence is shaped by assumptions rather than evidence, soldiers die walking into traps that proper analysis would have revealed. When time pressure prevents adequate planning, soldiers die because the details that might have saved them were overlooked in the rush to launch operations. When institutional priorities override tactical wisdom, soldiers die because the lessons that their predecessors learned in blood are ignored in favor of political expedience or bureaucratic convenience. The men of B Company, 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, paid the price for failures that originated far above their pay grade, and they did so with a level of courage and discipline that their commanders did not deserve, obeying orders that sent them into a meat grinder with inadequate intelligence and insufficient support. Corporal Robin Jones, attacking enemy positions at close range, even as his section was destroyed around him, his courage in the face of overwhelming fire, earning him a medal, but costing him comrades who could never be replaced. Private Richard Odendahl, crawling through fire again and again to save his wounded comrades, risking his life repeatedly to provide aid under conditions where survival was a matter of luck as much as skill. Lance Corporal Kerry Rooney, throwing grenades from his knees while bullets cracked past his head, leading his section forward even as the men around him fell. Second Lieutenant John O'Halloran, leading his men forward into certain death because those were his orders, a young officer doing his duty even when that duty demanded the ultimate sacrifice. And Major Ian McKay, carrying the weight of that day for 40 years before he could finally speak the truth, living with the knowledge that he had sent men to their deaths on orders that should never have been given. These men and the hundreds of others who fought at Ap My An on February 17, 1967, deserve to be remembered not just as casualties of war, but as victims of a system that valued the appearance of aggression over the reality of competence. Men who paid the price for institutional failures that were not of their making. Remember those young men who were ordered to fix bayonets they didn't carry and charge into machine gun fire? Now you know why. Not because of heroic necessity or tactical brilliance that demanded such desperate measures, but because of systemic failure that began at the highest levels of command and cascaded downward until it killed them. Not because of tactical brilliance or inspired leadership, but because of institutional arrogance that assumed the enemy would behave according to established patterns, and that superior firepower could overcome inadequate intelligence. Not because it was the right decision based on the available information, but because the pressure to prove Australian aggression overrode every other consideration, including the lives of the men being sent into the killing zone to satisfy political demands from Saigon. Operation Bribie was meant to demonstrate that Australian forces could fight with the same aggression that American commanders demanded, proving that the task force could conduct search and destroy operations with the same intensity as American units. Instead, it proved the wisdom of the cautious, deliberate approach that the Australians had been practicing all along, validating the methods that had produced success at Long Tan and questioning the American doctrine that Westmoreland was trying to impose. Both sides claimed victory, as both sides always do in ambiguous engagements where the outcome depends on how you define success. Both sides withdrew from the battlefield, with the Australians pulling back to Nui Dat, and the Viet Cong melting into the jungle to fight another day. And the Viet Cong wrote their assessment in blood on the side of a burning armored personnel carrier, an assessment that might have been the most honest evaluation of the entire war, unfiltered by political considerations or career concerns. The soldiers who fought at Bribie displayed the same courage, the same discipline, and the same sacrifice as those who fought at Long Tan, and they deserved the same recognition for their service and their sacrifice. But recognition came late, and for many, it came too late, arriving after they had died without ever receiving the acknowledgement they deserved. The truth was buried for 40 years under layers of official narratives and institutional reluctance to examine painful failures that raised uncomfortable questions about command decisions. When Ian MacKay finally broke his silence and told the story, he gave voice to hundreds of men who had carried that day in silence, wondering if anyone would ever understand what they had endured and why it had happened, why they had been ordered to charge into machine gun fire with bayonets they didn't carry. The final irony of Operation Bribie is that it became exactly what none of the participants intended, serving a purpose that no one had planned. Not a tactical victory for either side, since both withdrew from the battlefield without achieving their objectives, but a perfect demonstration of everything wrong with the way the war was being fought. A case study in institutional failure that would be analyzed for decades. A warning that was documented, analyzed, and then largely ignored as subsequent operations repeated the same mistakes with predictable results. The question isn't whether we've learned the lesson that Bribie teaches about the dangers of time pressure, inadequate intelligence, and piecemeal commitment. The question is how many more young men will die in future wars before we finally do, before the lessons purchased in blood at places like Bribie are actually implemented rather than filed away in staff college libraries. Every February 17th, the veterans gather at Bribie Island, and they remember the mates they lost and the lessons they learned in the most brutal classroom imaginable. The question for the rest of us is whether we will remember with them and whether we will honor their sacrifice, not just with words and ceremonies, but by demanding that their hard-won lessons are never forgotten and that future soldiers are not sacrificed to the same institutional failures. If you happen to be passing by one of these commemorations, salute them with a wave or a cooey in recognition of what they endured. They surely deserve it, these men who fought in a forgotten battle that should never be forgotten. Because Operation Bribie wasn't just Australia's worst day in Vietnam, though it certainly was that. It was a warning that every army in every war since has had the opportunity to heed, lessons written in blood that remain relevant decades later. Some have learned from Bribie and similar disasters, incorporating its lessons into doctrine and training. Most haven't, preferring to believe that their circumstances are different or that technology has solved the fundamental problems of warfare. And the cost of that institutional amnesia is always paid by the soldiers who cannot choose their battles, cannot question their orders, and cannot protect themselves from the failures of those who command them from safety, sending them into danger while remaining far from the consequences of their decisions.